Hello and welcome. My name is Robin Palmer and this is a DaVinci Resolve tutorial. And in this video, I want to cover the most pressing questions that get asked about Resolve, namely, how do I make it faster? How do I make my video editing faster and more efficient? How can I edit higher resolution files without bringing my computer screaming to its knees? Basically, how do I get the ultimate performance out of DaVinci Resolve? And it turns out that we have quite a few options, all of which are easy to implement thanks to Resolve's intelligent handling of resources. But first, some context, because it must be said that this is a complex subject. Resolve has many different uses. It's a non-linear video editor, a color grader, a visual effects engine, a file format converter, and so on. So your usage will differ from my usage of Resolve. And source footage is also very different in terms of resolution, color depth, bitrate, codec, and so on. So these factors also place different demands on your computer. If you have a budget, then upgrading your hardware is certainly a good thing to do. It's the obvious first step to take. Indeed, it's the only way to increase the raw processing power of your hardware to decrease rendering time, for example. None of the techniques I show you here will really do that. But even with the hardware you already have, there are strategies to optimize performance. And so in this video, I will look at two important techniques, which are the use of proxies and caching. And along with these techniques, I will look at various configuration settings that can make your life easier. But first, a word about hardware. Just to be clear, Blackmagic declares the minimum recommended hardware to be as follows. 16 gigabytes of system RAM if you're working on Windows or a Mac, and 32 if you're on a Linux system. And if you're using Fusion, 32 gig is the bare minimum on any platform. Secondly, you need a graphics card, a GPU, with at least 2 gig of onboard RAM, which is called video RAM. And for your processor, an 8-core CPU. And the minimum that I think is recommended in any of their particular hardware setups is an Intel Core i5 running at 2.9 gigahertz. So it's hard to avoid getting into numbers and facts and figures, but this is as complex as I'm going to get in this particular video. So this is why I never recommend a laptop for anything but the simplest video work. A laptop with the above minimum spec will be far more expensive than a desktop. It will run hot, and this will decrease all the component life. It's difficult to update since most laptops do not have user serviceable parts, especially if you're on a Mac, but even a lot of Windows and Linux-based systems lock down the RAM or the hard drives or some other components, which are easy on a desktop computer to get in and change. Now, enough said about hardware for this particular video because that's not my focus and it's really a very deep subject. So instead, let's grab some files to illustrate the techniques that I'm going to be using. So here I am on Pixabay. It's one of those websites that offers up some free content in order to drive you to their advertising partners. Here we've got Adobe stock, and down at the bottom, Shutterstock also. So I just found some clips of bees here, courtesy of Roy Bury. So thank you for your free clips. And these are in 4K, which won't be a big problem for my desktop computer to run, but we can check them out anyway. So what I did was I downloaded 3 clips, and here they are in an assets folder all ready to go. You can see that the files are quite small because they're only a few seconds long. I think like 7 and 8 seconds long each. So this is a sort of a convenient test, but it's hardly a stress test. So let me set up a project here. I'll call it the B project. Why not? The first thing I'll do is go to my media page and then drag my assets in. Here we go. And now we get this convenient little warning that appears. And if you click change, then the timeline will adapt to the clips to a certain point. We can change the timeline later and we will have a look at it. And you can see that I can scrub through these quite effectively. So there's a little jerkiness there just as the clip buffers at the beginning, but otherwise no big problem. So I'll set up, I'll just move all these into a new timeline and zoom in to the content that I have with this handy little button here. Now these clips will play fine, but I think we all well know the symptoms of poor performance, which would be dropped frames, rough playback, audio stuttering, clips playing too slowly, effects rendering too slowly, and so on. So let's give Resolve something to do then. Make it a bit harder. So I'll just I'll select one of these and go to the Fusion page. And then I'll just close up some panels I don't need right now. So what I'm going to do is just add in something that will take some processing. I'll add in abstraction. That's a good one to use. It's kind of fun. Whoops, it didn't click in properly, so I need to change my connections here so that I feed my input to abstraction and then to the output. There we go. And now I can just look at the inspector to see the properties for this abstraction effect. And you know, you can change any of these around. I'm just going to make some, I'm going to make it ugly but really obvious what I'm doing. You know, just so that I can tell and see now. Yeah, that's playing pretty slowly now. That's certainly having a little bit of an issue on my system dealing with 4K footage that's being processed live is a bit of a problem. So back on the edit page, maybe it's a better test if I have a look at how my timeline plays. So the first clip is super fine. We haven't done anything to it. The second clip, super fine. For some reason, we end up editing the third clip there. I didn't check that very carefully. Yeah, jerky. Now you can see this, if I play this clip over, you can see the sections that have a blue line should play quite well, and the ones that are red will you know, skip all over the map, essentially. So this line here indicates our cache, which I will talk more about later, but we start seeing this indicator like right away. So, and as we wait, you can see more and more of it's filling with blue to indicate a thumbs up situation that once that cache is filled, this will play perfectly. And the more attention that we pay to this clip, the more hints we give Resolve to fix this problem for us. There we go. So this is now rendered with the effect, and it looks just fine. We can start and stop as we wish. So there's something I should check out here in my project settings. So I'll click on that little gear icon, and I can see that my timeline is set to an HD, well, a 1080 timeline, and not this one here, not actually a 4K timeline, even though that was my footage. So if I save this and try again in 4K, you can see, first of all, that the cache has to re-render. And now this is, yeah, even these clips are now jerky. So playing back 4K footage in a 4K timeline is an issue for my computer, which is really quite underpowered. If it wasn't, then I couldn't demonstrate for you any of these techniques I'm going to show you. So it's a good thing it's not a supercomputer. So going back into the settings, I'm going to set it back to HD. Once again, that cache has to re-render. Now, up here, these three dots, I'm going to just point out an option on this menu. And this menu is actually just the viewer menu, but it's only got three dots to indicate that. And there's a setting here, show all video frames. Now, this is not going to get rid of any performance problems, but it will change how Resolve behaves. So if I set it there, as I just did to show all the frames, we hit a bad section, and you can see it slows down to show us every single frame, which can be very handy if we need to check our work on that basis. But if we had any audio synchronized, the audio would stutter and of course be well out of whack. So the default is that that setting is not checked, and in that case, we'll only play the frames that it can to catch up with the playhead, but it will ensure that the audio plays in sync. So it really depends on what your priority is, and there is that kind of hidden, obscure setting up there in the viewer menu that will change that for you. I should point out that Resolve has many processor-intensive tasks, including basic editing and scrubbing, particularly if you have codecs such as Camera Raw, codecs that come right out of your camera, or H.264, H.265. These are very demanding of the processor. And in fact, both are occurring with the current clip that I'm looking at. It is an H.264 clip. An obvious solution for these problems is to transcode clips before using them in the timeline. The primary advantage of this method is that you then have optimal files that will suit not just Resolve but other editing tools as well. So if your workflow involves multiple editing and video tools, then transcoding the files once only for your project can be an efficient solution. And though dedicated transcoding tools exist, that is to say, tools that convert video from one format to another, from one codec to another, Resolve itself can be used for the task here in the media page. So I strongly recommend you use these smart bins. I'm going to add a new one here actually. If I set up a new bin, I can just call it transcode or something so I know what's going on. And I now can select all of the clips that I wish to be transcoded based on some metadata that they may have. I don't really see too much up here, but it does indicate that they are H.264 at least, which is something. So I can use that as a way of filtering out my clips. And to do that, I will edit the bin that I set up. And of course, you can set up these different characteristics here. Basically, it's a filter. You're filtering your clips based on metadata. So if I select the video codec and then say it's going to contain H.264, actually, I can just say H dot, which will then catch 265 and other formats. And then you can see that in the transcode bin, it's got the 3 clips pre-selected. Now, for only 3 clips, this is not the most exciting technique in the world, but imagine that you have dozens or hundreds coming in after days of shooting. This is just a really, really quick way of dealing with the problem. So next I'll select all the clips in the bin and choose Media Management from the File menu. And it gives you this rather complex dialog. At the top, there are 3 tabs. Make sure Clips is selected. And below that are 3 more tabs. Make sure Transcode is selected. And then we can specify where we're going to save our transcoded media. And I have a dedicated folder called RIPS on my M drive that I use for this. And if I just sort of scroll down here, I can choose my video format. I do like using QuickTime as a container. It's basically an MOV file. And then for the codec, you have any number of choices. And I like using the Avid formats, the DNxHR formats. Furthermore, I can choose the flavor of format. And you want the best possible here, because you don't want to be losing any important visual information when you're doing the transcoding, because these files are going to be the ones that you're using in your project from here on. So in this case, maybe the 444 12-bit is definitely the highest quality. That could be overkill if your footage is not uncompressed color in 12-bit already. Codecs, I don't know, the topic of codecs is probably a bit too complex to get into fully in this video. Perhaps it's one that's worth revisiting, but this is definitely the best possible quality. And there's some other settings here that you might also want to fool around with. use constant bitrate is checked because the DNxHR are always constant bitrate. You can change the resolution and so on, though keeping it the same as your timeline resolution probably makes sense. So once you've generated these files, you'll want to place them in your assets folder and bring them into your media pool and use them in your timeline in place of those original files, which you no longer need to deal with. So sometimes it makes most sense to set up one project for this transcoding process with these as the assets, and then a second project for your actual timeline. So again, transcoding is a good solution if you're using multiple editing programs, video programs, and you want to start with the best possible files for all of them. However, if you are dedicated to using Resolve, there's a much better solution that prevents all that manual work. So if you come here to your project settings, first of all, your master settings, and scroll down to where it says optimized media and render cache. This is where you're going to set a bunch of key settings for using proxies. So a proxy is a low resolution clip that's going to stand in for the full-sized counterpart during your editing, grading, and so on. And you can see here that you can choose various options. The default choose automatically will only downsize clips if they are higher resolution than your timeline. So it makes sense to choose one of the other options. I've selected quarter in this case. And this way we know that it's downsizing. And once again, we have our choice of our codec. And in this case, we don't want the highest possible quality because that defeats the purpose. We want our proxies to be smaller, easier to read files. And so you can choose from some of the other codecs that are available here. I really prefer using these Avid formats because they're quite compatible across platforms. So the DNxHR. These settings are now to do with our caching and not our proxies, but I've just set them ahead of time here. So for example, setting all three toggles on results in the most sort of automatic settings that we can get, giving autonomy to Resolve and letting the background caching begin after 1 second, because why wait? We may as well start caching as soon as possible. Okay, so that set up the types of files, the codecs, and the resolution that we're going to use for our proxies. The next step is to create the optimized media. And you can see that that is an option here on the context menu. So once you've selected, in this case, 3 clips, and you choose that option from the context menu, it will generate the optimized media. This is the point at which you wait patiently. Again, with only about 20 seconds of clips, this happens, while I'm talking, but otherwise you might want to make lunch or go for a walk. And notice that we didn't specify where these were being stored, because in this case, they're stored in our cache, on our cache disk. We don't need to manage where those files are, what they're called, or anything else. Resolve does it for us. So it's really easy, much easier than manually handling transcoded files. But if you look here, the next thing to notice is there's absolutely no way to know that there's optimized media for these clips. And even if you go into the list view, there's nothing apparent here. So if you add a column, you do that by right-clicking, by the way, on the column header. And I'm going to add this column called Optimized Media. And now if I look at my list, I can clearly see in that column that it says quarter res. So this is a great way, again, with only 3 clips, it doesn't matter. But if you had hundreds of clips, some of which you optimized and some of which you didn't need to, this is a great way to actually see which are which. So going back to our timeline, the third and final step is to make sure that proxies are actually enabled. Playing back here, it's hard to tell necessarily. So here you can see the first option on the playback menu, use optimized media if available. That's already checked because there's no reason for it not to be checked. And this means that the DaVinci Resolve has already switched to using our proxies without us knowing. So really, this is a very, very transparent process. So the last thing I'd like to talk about with proxies is what you do when you're rendering your results. So let's go to the deliver page here. Now you really have 2 choices. If I open up the advanced settings here, and then scroll down. There's a setting called Use Optimized Media. And if you toggle this on right here, that means that your proxies will be used in your render. Now this is useful if you want to make quick comps to deliver to a third party and you're under time constraints and it just doesn't have to be full quality. That's fine. You can check this and gain the advantage of the proxies. But normally you don't want this checked because the proxies are there to speed up the performance, but you want to ensure that your final delivered video is at full quality, and that indeed is the default. The proxy method involves editing clips of lesser quality than what you're delivering. So it's really critical to check the rendered files carefully for artifacts that you may not have noticed in Resolve. This is particularly the case if you're doing extensive grading or effects, if you've downgraded the color from 10 to 8 bits, if you've selected a higher degree of color compression, or any other compromise. You may well have been too aggressive in some of your changes without the visual cues that would normally have alerted you. So I just want to mention that as a proviso. Always check your work very carefully. Our next main topic is caching, and I've already been discussing it, but I need to get into some particulars. So caching pre-renders demanding processes behind the scenes. Effects, grading, etc. are pre-calculated so that the clips can be rapidly displayed. And there are several types of caches in Resolve, each designed for a different purpose. So if we go into Fusion here and look at the node, you'll notice that there is a cache to disk option here. And this has various settings, but certainly we would wish caching to be enabled at least. So this is an example of node caching, which renders upstream Fusion nodes, upstream just meaning those previous in the chain, so that when you're working on downstream nodes, the process will go smoother. Fusion caching as a whole renders Fusion effects, titles and generators, speed and retime effects, and so on, and it improves the performance of subsequent trimming and grading operations. There's other types of caching. There's sequence caching, which accelerates timeline operations by rendering transitions, composites, opacity, that type of thing. There's color caching for our color grading. There's OFX caching for when you have OFX, like effects in your timeline, and so on. And all of these different types of caching work together in concert and are managed in a fairly complicated way by Resolve. We don't really need to know the details. We just need control over it. So the global cache settings up here on our playback menu, generally you either want it set to user, in which case you have full control, or smart, in which case you basically still have full control, but Resolve will do its best job. And then there's a separate option for Fusion cache memory, although the smart option is now called auto, so those aren't very consistent. But I just keep them on those settings. You can also manually choose whether individual clips cache by going to the context menu and having a look here. So again, there's a couple options. There's the cache Fusion output, which I have set to auto. And then there's the cache color output, which doesn't have a flyout menu because it's just a simple toggle. As you can see, I just toggled it on. So this one's got a flyout menu with 3 options. The second render cache color is only on or off. And if you've applied an effect to the clip, a third option will be present there for render OFX filter cache as well. So I've discussed the 2 main techniques, proxies and caching, and all that remains is to look at some of the ways we can tune performance by tweaking some of the many configuration settings that are scattered through Resolve. And if I start first of all in my project settings once again, you can see that there's under the master settings, there's this video monitoring section. And there's a couple things that we can do. Video bit depth is set to 10-bit by default, but unless you have a full 10-bit color workflow, this is kind of wasted. You're never going to be seeing 10-bit color anyway. So you can set that to 8-bit, which might just save a few processor cycles. And then similarly, monitor scaling, you could set to basic to reduce the quality when scaling clips. Again, something you may or may not even notice on the screen, depending on how good your hardware is. So that's a couple of configuration steps that can be handy. Up here at the top, remember we have our timeline. And sure enough, some people recommend decreasing your timeline resolution while you're working and then changing it back to what you want to deliver in. But I find that really proxies do the same job, but in a more fluid, controlled way, and you don't need to remember to come back into the configuration menu, the project menu here, because that's the sort of thing I would just forget. Under Camera Raw, we can improve how Resolve processes camera raw data. We can improve the performance by, again, reducing the resolution to half or quarter. It turns out these options here will differ based on the actual camera raw format that you have. That's basically it for our project settings. So now we'll come into the configuration, the preferences of DaVinci Resolve itself. And on the user tab, make sure you've clicked that, the user tab, and then go down the left to your playback settings. There are a couple things here that I've already checked. Hide UI overlays, which disables on-screen controls during playback to improve graphics performance. And the second one here, minimize interface updates during playback, does exactly what it says. It prioritizes the smoothness of playback over any interface actions like mousing that you might be trying. So you will notice that your mouse might be a bit jerky or buttons may not respond instantly when you click them when you have this setting on. Right below those options are the performance modes, and I have these set to automatic because I have no clue as to why you would ever change this. But just to be complete, I'm going to just mention that, you've got 3 settings you can toggle on or off in different combinations to optimize sizing or decode quality or image processing. Again, like so many other things, I just let Resolve manage these settings. But you may be advised by tech support or a forum post, in your particular case with your own particular setup, that some of this might help you. So I just want to make sure I've covered all of these things in the same video for you. On the System tab under Memory and GPU, there's a couple really helpful and important things to note here. First of all, you can see how much system memory you have. I have 16 gig installed, and you can tweak how much Resolve uses out of that. So here it's only letting me use a maximum of 12 gigabytes out of the 16 because, of course, the operating system needs memory as well. But I can tune this down if I wish, and if I had a lot more memory, I probably would, so that there was memory reserved for multitasking with other programs. But because I only have 16 gig, I try not to multitask when I'm running Resolve. Also, you can limit how much memory out of that Fusion is going to use, and I have it cranked up to the max because I'm using Fusion on a system that really is underpowered. Below that is the GPU configuration, and this is where you can check out your actual graphics cards that are installed. And again, the processing mode should really be set to auto, but you can see here that I have 2 different APIs available. On a Mac, you might see Metal, for example, which is the API that Apple has used in place of these. But it's important that at least one API is listed here for Resolve to work optimally. If you have an older graphics card that doesn't support any of these, then you really need to upgrade that card for sure. Under GPUs, you can see it's listed my one GeForce GTX 960, but if I had multiple graphics cards, they would all be listed here along with their APIs so that I could select between them. There's also a place where you can specify hardware acceleration if you have the paid version Resolve Studio and a compatible NVIDIA GPU. So it's not visible in this screenshot, the option I'm talking about, because I'm using the free version of Resolve on this computer. So this sort of hardware acceleration is always being improved by Blackmagic, even in the latest point update of 16.2, but it does require an NVIDIA GPU and so will not work on a Mac. The final setting I'd like to discuss is one that's rather confusingly named. So back out here on my timeline, if I check out the playback menu, you'll see that there's a proxy mode setting, third one down. And you can choose between off and half resolution and quarter resolution, the sorts of choices that are becoming quite familiar to you by now. Now, this has nothing to do, as near as I can tell, with the proxy file method described earlier. It's nothing to do with optimized media. It only changes how your viewer displays your timeline by resizing clips on the fly. So it's a playback enhancement, and that's why it's on the playback menu, and it might increase performance. So in conclusion, I've given you numerous tweaks that you can make to your Resolve configurations. And in addition, I discussed two important features, proxies, which are easy to manage in a three-step process. First, you specify the proxy codecs in your project settings. Then you generate optimized media only for those clips that need optimized media. And a smart bin is helpful there. And then you turn on the use of optimized media, which can just be a default setting anyway in your project. And then those proxy files are managed completely automatically for you. And secondly, I discussed caching, which also largely works automatically to improve the performance behind the scenes, but it does allow that fine-grained control over specific clips or nodes when you need it. And all of this means that you can get the most out of your hardware, editing even 4K footage on computers that are far below the recommended hardware specification. And this is definitely brilliant for those of us who don't have infinite budgets for computer upgrades. I hope that this tutorial has been useful and helpful for you, and that it improves your enjoyment of working with DaVinci Resolve. My name is Robin. Thanks so much for watching. Stay safe.